Welcome to Joe and Septa podcast, and this will be our last chapter for amusing ourselves to death.
Who are you?
I'm Joe.
I'm Adam.
That face you're making, God, dude. I was like, is he frozen? This is perfect timing to disconnect again.
Oh yeah.
But yeah, so the last and final chapter, chapter 11, amusing ourselves to death, is the Huxleyan morning.
Which I do want to point out because when we started this, I was using the word Huxleyan, and we were like, I don't know if anybody's using that word, because I was sort of describing like a Huxleyan dystopians as Orwellian, and I don't know if this is the first instance of that, but vindication.
Yeah,
I mean, I had read it before, so
we all know that everybody likes to use the word Orwellian, so I can't say I've heard other people in pop culture and just in general use Huxleyan. Even though that we've seen through the course of this book, he was much more on point, I think. Not to say that Orwell wasn't, but yeah.
right. So the Huxleyan warning, chapter 11. I think this chapter, it does tie up the book in a relatively nice way. I have to admit that the latter half of the book, once you get past like Peekaboo World and now this, where you go into religion,
Get specific examples and things that he
electing,
explores. Yeah,
and then education,
yep,
that was like a little slower for me, but
I
like
agree.
worthwhile to. And I think it's also important to note that this thing with Huxley and with Brave New Worlds and with Orwell in 1984, I think that makes the book more accessible, because without that stuff, it might feel like strictly academic. And this made it, which like constantly coming back to those themes, made it, I think, more available to me and
Sure,
hopefully to other people.
sure. It just provides a better structure for argument, I guess, because I just took those as more or less evidence to further support his claims.
Yeah. So we usually, well, we started this later in our series, but we like to ask a question of viewers or listeners to sort of think about as they're listening to the rest of our conversation, and to think about as they go off in their lives. So in a little bit of a break from that, we're going to read a series of questions, but they're all important. And then I would like to encourage people to formulate their own questions and ask questions like this about certain things. So first, and this is a big first question, but what is information? Joe, what is it?
Or more precisely, what are information?
What are its various forms?
What conceptions of intelligence, wisdom, and learning does each form insist upon?
What conceptions does each form neglect or mock?
What are the main psychic effects of each form?
What is the relation between information and reason?
What is the kind of information that best facilitates thinking?
Is there a moral bias to each form of information?
What does it mean to say that there is too much information?
How would one know?
What redefinitions of important cultural meanings do new sources, speeds, contexts, and forms of information require?
Does television, for example, give a new meaning to piety, to patriotism, to privacy?
Does television give a new meaning to judgment or to understanding?
How do different forms of information persuade?
Is a newspaper's public different from a television's public?
And how do different information forms dictate the type of content that is expressed? That's a lot of questions.
Yeah. And this last chapter gives a little bit of a summation again of some of his ideas. Going back to Huxley again, contrasting with Orwell again, just like in the foreword. And then in the latter couple pages, attempts to give, I don't know if I say he attempts to give hope, but he does attempt to provide some sort of solution. And I think if there's anything that Neil Postman wants you to get out of this book, is to walk away perhaps asking yourself these types of questions. And if we can get
Mm.
other people to ask these types of questions, that would be a step in the direction we want to be in terms of education and in mitigating some of these problems.
Oh yeah, well, very well said. I think, yeah, I think that's a great point. Those the asking the question is central to his argument. So Joe, we talked about this early on about the differences between Huxley and Orwell. And one of the things we talked about in one of the early episodes is about the ubiquity of Orwellian and sort of the lack of Huxleyan stuff in fiction, specifically, I was talking about, but even just in normal understandings. And there's some segments in here that points to why that could be, which I think we covered before, but it's nice to have um, Postman sort of acknowledge those. Is there something you want to read specifically about that?
Here, this first one we got here.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Page 156. So this is concerning, I guess, history, and he's pointing out some philosophers here in that he fears that philosophers have given us no guidance in this matter. So, we take arms against a sea of troubles. You trust by the spirit of Milton, Bacon, Voltaire, Goethe, and Jefferson. What if there are no cries of anguish to be heard? Who is prepared to take arms against a sea of amusements? To whom do we complain? And when? And in what tone of voice? When serious discourse dissolves into giggles. What is the antidote to a culture's being drained by laughter?
Hmm. Why did that stick out to you as an important point?
Well, like you did preface by saying, like, in terms of pop culture, we know we hear things about Orwell, we don't necessarily hear about Huxley. And you go back in with some of these scholars that he's mentioned,
Hmm.
and a lot of them talk about, the fears of authoritarianism and stuff like that, and addressing forms of like an ideal government. And a lot of
Mm.
these things, a lot of the fears kind of align with some of the themes that Orwell outlines, and his proposition of the future turning into a prison
Mm.
versus Huxley turning into a burlesque, a much different
Right.
future.
Yeah. I think it's really important to think about this because the idea who is prepared to take arms against a sea of amusements, that's central to Brave New World in that everything's
Yes.
exciting, everything's amusing, everything's provided for you, and are also indoctrinated into being a certain level, like class, doing a certain job, and whatever else, and people like that. And that's the problem, is this amusing ourselves to death. The key is that we like being amused, we like being entertained to our own detriment, because as we see, who is gonna take up arms when things are going great and they don't have to focus on politics or climate change or pandemics or natural disasters or any number of things? If we can keep them like placated and complacent and just living their lives, focusing on, they do their job, they come home, they sit with their family, they watch television, they go to bed, they and if we just keep them doing that, it's very hard, one, to incentivize them to have a meaningful revolution or uprising if one is required, and it's also very difficult for them to break out of that. And part of this is because of capitalism. Part of this is because a lot of other reasons. But it's like, if everything's going well or seemingly going well, who would want to stop that? But the idea is that well, things aren't going well for everybody. Just because they're going well for you, what
Sure.
about these other people it's not going well for? Aren't you concerned about them? But they don't have the capacity to think about them because things are going well for them, and so they're entertained and they're placated.
Yeah, that's well said.
What do you think, or do you think serious discourse has dissolved into giggles?
I guess it depends on whose perspective it is. If you're gonna take something like people getting into arguments on Facebook, you're
Hmm.
if you're one of those parties, well, with the exception of people that are trolling, those people are generally taking very seriously. But from an outside perspective, like me, not using Facebook and posting stuff there,
Mm-hmm.
I might be giggling. I find
But
some bickering to be quite amusing on there.
yeah, but if we know particularly of a certain friend of ours or a group of people who engage commonly on something like Facebook and say potentially inflammatory stuff. But is that do they think that's serious discourse? And if they do, is it not? Like, because I'm not sure that that's actually serious discourse. That might be
They
giggles.
might
Not, I
uh
didn't.
they might think it is, but I don't. Can Facebook even be a place for serious discourse?
No.
I don't think so either.
Can it be a place for giggling?
Sure.
Sure. It's good at that. It's good at that. Yeah.
Is that just because of the state that social media has devolved into? Because I'm sure there's other electronic forms, boards that you can go to that perhaps are a place for serious discourse.
Sometimes there are. There isn't that's available to people. Whether or not it gets attention is a different a thing. Okay, so as we move through this chapter, we mentioned some of the previous philosophers giving us no guidance in this particular matter. One of the things Postman points out is that what is happening, and he's specifically pointing this to what is happening in America in the 80s. But he makes it clear that his fears don't aren't connected to a specific ideology. He says no Mein Kampf or Communist Manifesto announced
Mm-hmm.
its coming. Would be no far right or far
Yeah, I
left
like that.
doctrine would be would have predicted what we're on, because the show business culture and the age of television and television as a media and a medium and for doesn't really care about either one of those. And that's concerning on many levels, but the indifference of it, I think, is sort of it's almost in opposition to the idea that they have no bias, or it seems like it at the start, because you're like, well, it's not left wing or it's not right wing. But it does have a bias. It's just not a bias towards one of those. It's a bias towards something else. And that's another thing that comes up is this the biases of technology.
Whether or not technology is neutral, which
Yeah.
I don't think we'll get into, but I found that to be an interesting philosophical claim to think about. Just because
Yes.
we don't know what a technology's bias is, doesn't determine its position, I suppose.
Yeah. I think Postman does a good job of attempting to establish and maybe prove or solidify what the biases of something like television is, right? That's part of the previous episodes and the previous chapters, and saying, look at this thing when it's not on television, look at this thing when it is on television. how has it changed? That's the bias of television, right? So if we look at religion, we look at politics, we look at
Mm-hmm.
education, how has it changed fundamentally? And then we can start to notice the biases of
Yeah,
television,
and just to
which,
interject quickly, I won't read this quote. I think we kind of passed over here, but it's just the first part here that we had. But it is an ideology nonetheless. So, and he's talking about television here and the different ways that television changes culture, and in a way, it's changed. It's made enough differences to I can see why you can say that television is in a way an ideology, because it's even messing with our cognition and education and ways of learning, which we will get into a bit as about education and some
yeah.
of the solutions here.
Well, do you want to read that full thing?
If you feel like it's necessary, but
I think because I think the last part is really good, but maybe
okay,
the setup is fine.
okay,
So
I'll read it. Page 157. But it is an ideology nonetheless. For it imposes a way of life, a set of relations among people and ideas, of which there has been no consensus, no discussion, and no opposition, only compliance. Public consciousness has not yet assimilated the point that technology is ideology.
I think that's very true. I don't
It's
think public
very
consciousness.
That's very well said.
Yeah, I don't. I'm shocked because, well, I'm not shocked that it's not, but
Sure.
that because the powers that be have in it made it hard to get to that point. But
Yeah.
even thinking about technology, if we want to put in television or put in social media or put in the internet as an ideology, in being that it imposes a way of life, a set of relations among people and ideas, and everything else he just says,
Mm,
therefore making it an
yeah.
ideology is a very distinct way of thinking about ideology as
Yeah,
a term. And it,
that's super well said. Way better than I said it.
well, but I mean, all it is to say is that, and that we get to this later, is that we're not thinking about this in that way. I don't think the common folk, which I'm a part of, in mass, think about social media being its own ideology that's separate from right or left, separate from Democrat or Republican or Libertarian or Socialist or this or that, separate from any religious ideology, separate from any, educational ideology or
Yeah, if you
philosophy.
can just sorry.
It's just it's its own thing, and recognizing that is enlightening because it makes me question the ideology of everything. What is the
Sure.
ideology of blenders?
Yeah, if you can think back to maybe what your opinion on this matter as a whole was before you had read this book. I certainly wasn't really along this line of thinking. I don't think. Sure, I'm asking myself how technology and social media has influenced culture, but
Yeah.
this this method of like epistemology and television literally pervading all facets of culture is a lot further reaching than I anticipated.
I think it would be I agree, but I think for us personally, we can point to I've been off Facebook and stuff for a number of years now. Uh After I'd read this the first time, but not since I came to it. And you have been limiting internet use or social media use or Reddit use in particularly, which I'm still someone who goes on Reddit, unfortunately. But I am constantly thinking about these things because Reddit itself has an ideology, right? And those groups on there have their own ideology. Um, and We were taking steps, and I've been encouraging people to take steps to sort of move away from, like, I've been a relatively long time advocate for deleting Facebook, deleting Instagram, deleting WhatsApp, like just separating yourself from that. I don't use Google most of the time. And even something like even am uncomfortable with things Apple does too, right? But so we were kind of moving in this way of analyzing these things because
Sure.
we were noticing probably very personal like effects of them. Like it wasn't
Yes.
about society at large necessarily, but it was like, how am I managing my time? What am I ingesting? What is this doing to my brain? What is it doing to how I conduct myself? How is it affecting how I talk or how I write? And how is it affecting how I think? And I found it personally beneficial to not be on Facebook because I didn't find it good for me to be on there. Now, I don't think at the time extended that to culture in the way that Postman does.
I agree. I think I'm in the same boat with you there. Okay, with that said, let's transition to the latter half of the chapter here, where I think the big oh, did you have something to say?
Do you want to talk about this example of a month abstaining from television that this town went on? Because maybe that can transition us, or for sake of time, we can sort of skip that or give it a brief rundown.
I'll leave it up to you, man. I mean, we did preface and have a little conversation about this beforehand. I don't know if I'm
Yeah.
willing to go down that rabbit hole again, although I thought
Right.
it was
Right.
awfully interesting. But you can
Yeah.
maybe just mention it, and then it'll segue us into the whole
So
solutions area.
there he talks about this town. What was it? Farmington? Where was that?
I don't remember where it was.
Yes, Farmington, Connecticut. Library console to sponsor a TV turnoff. So for a month, the residents there would try to abstain from watching television for a month. Now, when Postman brings this up in this last chapter, he does seem somewhat dismissive of that as practice. He recognizing that it should be applauded, but I think he's um, not convinced that it has a meaningful effect or benefit, which is what we went down the rabbit hole on. I think you and I would think probably at this point that limiting television or limiting internet or social media use for any amount of time is probably a good thing. And
Right.
that's whether or not you develop the inquisitive nature that some of those questions we read at the beginning arise in your own life. Like, because if you go back to it immediately and don't think about it, it's probably still good to limit, even for a month, it's probably still good, right? But the hope is that in doing so, you develop a sort of curiosity and recognition of the things that are different, and hopefully it's better, and so therefore you can continue to abstain from things in a meaningful way.
Yeah, thanks for saying that. I feel like that embodies my position there pretty good, at least from what we had talked about.
Yeah, which leads us into this sort of thing where he's talking about public health. He says he's not necessarily optimistic about people taking some things seriously, such as abstaining. And he says the A Team and Cheers, this is written in the 80s, are no threat to public health. But he says 60 Minutes, Eyewitness News, and Sesame Street are. This is on 160. Continuing, he says the problem in any case does not reside in what people watch. The problem is in that we watch. And the solution must be found in how we watch, which leads us, I think, to the potential solutions that he puts forward right at the end of this.
I'm gonna interrupt you real quick, and I want to read this little line.
Yeah.
We would all be better off if television got worse, not better. I thought that was kind of funny.
Yeah. What do you think he means by that?
Well, if it got worse or less entertaining, it wouldn't be as appealing to people. Versus to get better would be to be more entertaining
Yeah.
and exacerbate our problem even more.
Right. And I think we should note that, like, the distinction here for A-Team or Cheers, those are like fictional narrative, uh,
Junk
television
television, as you would
television
say.
shows, which now we're in what's sort of called, or maybe at the end of like a golden age of television, where you have Breaking Bads, or you have Mad Men, or Westworld, or you have all these like amazing shows that people like, Game of Thrones for the most part, or anything. There's a ton of content and it's great. And I think he would make an exception and say like those are all good things and those allow us to ask important questions about society. The problem is though that things like 60 Minutes or any punditry on television, or Hannity or Carlson or Maddow, or
Sesame
any of those
Street.
things. So yeah, Sesame Street. Those things also got better in what you said, better at entertaining, better at putting graphics up on the thing, better at being more instantaneous, better at having a farther reach, better at being more captivating, more anger inducing, more, I guess, thought provoking in some ways, but not in
Peekaboo.
the appropriate
And
way.
now
Yeah,
this.
right, exactly. And they've gotten better at that, which is unfortunate. While TV has gotten better in fictional ways or whatever, in narrative, uh, so has our what's supposed to be real, quote unquote, or the epistemologies that television offers us has also gotten better. And maybe they've gotten better through using narrative as well. But that's why I think it's such an interesting thing to say that we would all be better off if it just got worse, if it just got shittier, like, and then that would be beneficial to all of us. And I think it's a fun thing to think about, and I might tend to agree. I mean, if Facebook and Twitter and YouTube were worse at, if their algorithms were worse, or the machine learnings were worse at keeping people on the platform or getting people into rabbit holes, that would probably be better for us. But that's not the case. It's just getting better and better and better at recognizing things like that and feeding you exactly what you want at exactly the time you want it before you even know it.
Yep.
So what are the solutions, Joe?
All right, I'll read this solutions quote from Postman here. I thought it was although this whole last chapter, I think this is what really struck a chord with me, given some conversations that Adam and I have had in the past, and just conversations that have frequently come up, especially in the infancy of podcasting. Just kind of spitballing stuff. This perfectly embodies the results of some of our conversations and how we felt about it.
Mm-hmm.
So page 162. The desperate answer is to rely on the only mass medium of communication that, in theory, is capable of addressing the problem, or schools. This is the conventional American solution to all dangerous social problems, and is, of course, based on a naive and mystical faith in the efficacy of education. The process rarely works.
Oof. It stings almost. Like,
I just love his confrontational, straight to the point writing style. Love it.
yeah, rarely works. And do you think he's right? First, do you think that is the mode in which we should address the problem and address
Schools.
many social problems? Yes. And then do they rarely work?
I mean, I guess yes to both of those things. Um, whether or not approaching schools works or not, I mean, we would do it no matter what, improve our education regardless. If it's the best solution that we have, and perhaps it is, I don't know. I can't necessarily come up with a better suggestion. Then it is a little bit concerning.
Yeah. Yeah.
I mean, in a perfect world, yes, we could have wonderful education and we would be able to mitigate people becoming flat earthers, etc. for the
Mhm.
mass amounts of problems that we have that are coming arise here in America recently because resulting from social media that is was frankly super unforeseen.
Yeah. Unforeseen so much, though, it's so much that Postman actually writes, I don't know the page, but he says, "Computers, I think, are overrated," which we had both had a good chuckle at because, as prescient as this book is, as easy it is to draw, like, a linear, line from television to internet to social media, we can replace, a lot of the times he says television with other forms of media that we now he seemed to really understand how those would work, but I don't think he understand the mass ubiquity of computers and of smartphones and constantly having in our pockets and in our hands and in our faces something that is akin to television, and in that way, it's very prescient, but he was sort of short-sighted in thinking that wouldn't happen because, I think he would be, quite profound, and it might be worth writing a book, someone who's a scholar or an educator to write a similar book as this about social media and the internet. Now, there may be some, I'm not aware of them off the top of my head, and I haven't read them. Um, but so much of this, there's just a through line where it's almost so you can just pop out television and pop in social media and say, what does social media do to religion? What does it do to politics? What does it do to education? What does it do to science? What does it do to any epistemology that we do? How does the medium affect it, which is such an important part of this book? In saying that it fundamentally changes it based on the medium, just like writing changes things, television changes things, or telegraphy changes things, or telegraphy, or but the internet and social media changed things just at a very base level, very, very like bottom rung of the ladder level, changed things automatically. And I think it's worthwhile to acknowledge. Um,
For sure, for sure.
what
Hold
is
on. I wanted to, I guess, bounce the question back off of you. I know you often have said, all right, maybe you or we have said, education is the answer. I know we both have similarities and differences in our approach to something like privacy,
yeah.
and I guess one of the answers we've come upon for that is better education to mitigate that, so we don't have to deal with censorship and stuff like that.
Mm.
So I'm just curious. Yeah, what are your thoughts? Are you would you still advocate for this? Do you have other suggestions as well, or are you just pretty much in line with Postman here?
So I probably fall into that segment about how America always addresses social problems. It's always going back to like our schools have to do it. So our schools have to teach kids how to have strong critical thinking skills, have to understand the scientific method, have to, and I think schools can do a better job. Incredibly hard to legislate better schools. Um, there seems to be a way in regards to privacy. I think our schools, like I said before this, hopefully we foster a environment where people are continuously learning, where you're never not in school. I know you're an adult and you're working your job, but you're learning about how to think about things in a way that's beneficial. And
Not just getting
maybe,
that undergrad degree just for the job, just for the higher
yeah.
pay.
Right, and that's a problem with the schools is that if high school is its only intention is to get you into college, and if college only intention is to get you a job in a specific field so you can earn money and live your life, I think that's just I'm using the word fundamentally a lot, but that's like a a a wrong assumption. Like that's not how it should be set up. Unfortunately, it is because the capitalist machine or whatever,
Yep.
uh, or the school to prison pipeline or the school to office pipeline or school to factory pipeline or whatever, is that's what it's been set up to get to instead of thinking about how we ingest information, instead of thinking about what is the kind of information that best facilitates thinking, what it, all the things we asked in the beginning. And then I think about how do we fix education. So that's another complex thing. Neil Postman was a teacher, he was a professor, he was an educator, and I think he wrote about in other books, the philosophy of teaching, and this is something that we are thinking about, in other ventures, including reading Descartes or discourse on metaphysics or whatever, of what is the best philosophy of learning, of knowing, and continuing on.
I'd like to follow up with another second question here, the one I before you got cut off last night. And I was asking, okay, education is the answer. But this problem has come up relatively recently, and what do we do for the people that aren't in school anymore? How do we address, I don't know, the much older demographics? How do we reach them if they're not in school anymore?
Yeah. So I wonder if the nonsensical answer that he puts forth is sort of a way to do that. First, what I said about fostering an environment that people are continuously learning,
Sure.
always in school. If we can get adults who aren't in classrooms, who are in their jobs and in their homes, to think about how, what information changes,
Yeah,
think about the mediums, think about all those things, then that's great. And if they can learn about any other myriad of things as well, like that's good to continue doing that.
maybe podcasting is one of those things.
Maybe, perhaps, yeah, perhaps. And the internet has been good at some of those things because there is a lot of good stuff out there. And then we should try and get better at sussing out what are the good things, what are the true things, and how can we know things, which is so much about from discourse on the method. And I don't know if I have an inkling that people who grew up and our age and people who are younger than us are better at deciphering and decoding the internet as far as what is something that's real and what is something that's not when they're reading
I
something.
like to
I
think
think
so
they
too.
can be as opposed to my parents or my parents' parents. They might see
Absolutely.
something on Facebook, and because it comes from their friend or it comes from someone they know personally or they trust, they think that that's now something that is real. Whereas younger people, I think, who grew up in this era and grew up on the internet, I think have a keener eye for misinformation. I hope. Maybe that's optimistic, but
I
I
don't think it
think that's
is.
the
I think
case.
I don't know. I won't branch out on that, but I agree.
Yeah. So we talked about the schools. That's what Neil Postman says is the desperate answer. Just prior to that, he says the nonsensical answer, and that's using parody or satire to show people how television changes things. But he says it's nonsensical because, or as you put before we recorded, it's ironic because those things would then have to fall into the same trappings of other television. So, in order to address how terrible television is for public discourse, it would have to be entertaining, or it'd have to be funny, or it'd have to be amusing. And so then it's sort of a deep irony that is almost inescapable. And so the act of criticism of the thing would have to be co-opted and make use of the thing, which is that's a tough line to walk there. But it might be worthwhile pursuing,
Might be.
especially in reaching people who aren't in schools, who they if there's a skit or a bit or something that can make people, it is entertaining or it's funny or whatever, and they think, oh, you know what, maybe I should think about social media in a different way. Well, then it might be worthwhile, even having used the exact things that are dangerous about social media.
Yeah, I mean, there's things like I didn't watch it, but on Netflix, there's something like The Social Dilemma. I think
Yeah,
I like to think that was pretty enlightening for some people. I mean, I think my dad watched it. He tried to get me to. I wasn't super interested, but
I
I
didn't
think
watch it
I got the
either.
gist of it. I think
I have a
I
feeling I know
think
what it's
uh
about.
I think Tristan Harris had some part in producing that film.
I think so too. I think so too. Um, so we're getting to the end of this chapter here
Yeah.
because he gets to these solutions at the end. He does want to say that the situation is not hopeless. And one of the things we talked about last night and this morning, it was that asking the questions, acknowledging the dangers is the first step. I mean, in any 12-step program, like admitting shortfalls and admitting
Mm.
powerlessness, acknowledging the problem is exactly the first step. So to say we're not thinking about media correctly or in an appropriate way, just having that, even if you don't have the answer, that's like a step, an incremental movement in the right direction. Um, that brings us kind of to the end of the book. I mean, there's
Yeah.
there's other things from this chapter that you want to touch on?
Not particularly. Not anything that would it would more or less segue into something pretty deep, like we had
Yeah.
previously discussed, which is fine. I think our point here is to emphasize the big points, the big takeaways, the big message of Neil Postman, and hopefully we've been able to embody his position in a faithful way. So yeah.
Yeah. Can I read just that one thing from someone else's analysis of it that I thought was
Oh sure.
very well put? So this points to asking those questions, but this said the first step towards counteracting the harmful effects of television are to recognize the way that it has an inherent bias to a certain kind of discourse, then to acknowledge that no technology is neutral, and that while our society is certainly defined by our media metaphor, that we still have the option to allow or confront those limitations, which Postman's like whole point, I think, is that we can we're cognizant of these things. If we can recognize the dangers, then we can question them and we can choose whether to allow them or oppose them. And I think that's really important to keep that sense of hope because I think Postman had a sense of hope, and I'd like to, just for my own like sanctity or my own peace of
Maybe just a
mind.
sliver, I'm not so sure.
Yeah,
Even he
I want to.
scoffs at his lack of solutions.
Yeah, but if you're optimistic and saying get people to recognize the problem and acknowledge it, and then everything else comes afterwards. Because if we refuse to admit it, then we fall further into Brave New World. Then the Huxleyan warning fell upon deaf ears.
All right, I think it might be time to close this baby out.
This is a good book.
Yeah, we've had a great time with it. So this is the last two sentences here of the book, and I'm gonna read it to y'all. So concerning Aldous Huxley, he believed with H.G. Wells that we are in a race between education and disaster, and he wrote continuously about the necessity of our understanding the politics and epistemology of media. For in the end, he was trying to tell us that what afflicted the people in Brave New World was not that they were laughing instead of thinking, but that they did not know what they were laughing about and why they had stopped thinking.
Wow.
But
And I think that concludes our series for the most part on amusing ourselves to death. So if anybody watched all of this and listened, thank you. And we have some stuff to continue slightly down this path, but maybe taking some tangential uh, uh, shortcuts or byways or intersections or moving through other things. But I've really enjoyed learning about this and reading this book and having in-depth discussions with you, Joe,
yeah,
because
it was
I
great.
think in doing the discussions, we really got to some more stuff. Unfortunately, it would probably take less time to read the book than to listen to watch all of this, but hopefully there's enough there that we discussed that is supplemental to the book.
Yeah, so I think we haven't totally decided yet. We may or may not do another episode concerning this book in some sort of other creative format. Not sure if we'll land
Yeah,
upon something,
yeah.
but after that, I think we'll choose a new reading, and that's kind of what's coming up. So
Yeah, so that like I said, that concludes the series on Amusing Ourselves to Death by Neil Postman, and this has been Joe and Adam's Hepta podcast, and I'm Adam,
and I'm Joe. Thanks for
and
listening.
thanks. Yeah,
That was a good time. Very
oh
much
yeah,
enjoyed it.
oh yeah.